Hello, fellow time travellers. First of all, as many of you will have heard many times before, but I never know who's here for the first time, I want to give a big thanks to all who support the series by signing up to my patreon.com site. That's where the funds come that make the whole series possible. So if you're already there doing that, thank you. If you're not a member at Patreon but you'd like to become one, then follow the link on here and go. Go to patreon.com, find me by name and join up. It's cheaper if you join for a whole year, but you can pay month by month. Either way, you'll be supporting what we do here, and you'll also get a privileged access to extra content. You get first glance at new content. There's a Q&A that's for members only, question and answers where I can sort of engage quite directly with people, and it also stimulates conversations that then take on a life of their own. We do some competitions as well with prizes. That Patreon site and this channel, it's all about history. We're all united by love of history and a strange sense, a shared sense that by watching what's happened in the past, by watching the way people responded to war and plague and all of the existential challenges, that we might get a heads up about what we should do next. Anyway, that's why history matters. Okay, it's time now to strap into the time machine as we step off towards the next stop in my love letter to the world. Recorder, microphone, action.
By main force they easily overpowered the rulers of the land. They then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. Kingdoms and powerful city-states rising and falling. Exodus, immigrants, refugees and wanderers. Stories fossilised in the Bible as new technologies drove change and the legend of the centaur rode into history. In ancient Egypt, the finest chariots ever conceived were unleashed in war against the mighty Hyksos, and these mysterious foreign kings were driven out, leaving not a trace of their existence behind. Endeavouring to understand history in order to try and illuminate the future. I'm Neil Oliver, and this is my love letter to the world.
Hi Neil. In the last episode we watched the germination of the world's oldest religion. Which moment in history are we travelling to this week?
Hi Paul. Yes, we watched as a refined and all-encompassing culture spread right across the Indian subcontinent, helping to unify a landmass the size of Europe. This week we're heading to ancient Egypt to witness the moment this incredible empire, which lasted for centuries, brings all its power and ingenuity to bear and releases the gods of war. The moment in the story of the world this week, Paul, is back in Egypt. It takes us quite a while to escape the gravitational pull of Egypt. Egypt, in its own self-contained way, mattered for a long time. It's such a long period. It's thousands of years of Egyptian civilization. It's quite useful to think about it in terms of a kind of a triple-layered sponge cake. A lower sponge, which is the Old Kingdom, then an indeterminate, quite thin layer of jam called the First Intermediate Period, then another sponge called the Middle Kingdom, then a second indeterminate thin layer of jam called the Second Intermediate Period, and then topped off with the third sponge, which is the New Kingdom. And a lot of the really exciting stuff that people think about in terms of Egypt happens in the New Kingdom. You've got all the Ramesses pharaohs, and you've got their greatest extent of their geographical dominance happens in that top layer of sponge.
What's the timescale of these things? How long did they last?
It's 3,000 years of Egyptian history.
Wow.
The kingdoms, the Old, Middle and New Kingdom They last for centuries. But they're broken up by these two periods called the intermediate periods. The three thick layers of sponge are times of control, dominance, cohesion, but they're punctuated by these two thin layers of disruption, some chaos, followed each time by the Egyptians reasserting control and pulling it all back together again. The moment that we're interested in, it's in the second intermediate period, that second thin layer of jam that comes before the new kingdom. And it's a time of uncertainty and disruption. And to this day, Egyptologists and historians, they don't agree entirely on what happened. And for me, that lack of certainty actually makes it all the more interesting. I like the idea. You tend to think of the Egyptologists having that whole period screwed down pretty tightly, but they don't. And this is periods running hundreds of years, where even the specialists who invest lifetimes in the study, they can't agree. Some of them are certain about certain things, but they don't. There's not consensus across the piece. The time of Egypt, obviously it has within it the time of the patriarchs of the Old Testament of the Bible. Enfolded within that great expanse of Egyptian time are the stories involving the figures that even if you're not a person of faith, even if you don't read the Bible, you will almost certainly have heard of people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. These are names that you can't grow up in the Judeo-Christian world as we have and not at least have heard those names. You maybe wouldn't be able to say much more about them than that they were biblical figureheads. If you thought about it even for a moment, you would accept that those figures cast shadows, long shadows, over the three great monotheisms. Judaism, the religion of the Jews, Christianity, and Islam. Those figures matter to all three of those great faiths. They're understood in different ways within those three faiths, but they're there, kind of immovable figures. And a lot of us have come to think of the Bible as being almost like fairy stories, almost like the stuff of childhood. You know, those that dismiss the Bible just tend to dismiss it all as myth, mumbo-jumbo, makey-uppy. But if you think about it just for a minute, you would probably have to reasonably accept that there were real flesh and blood figures behind those names. And the reality of them, the truth of them, is certainly obscured to a certain extent by all the telling and the retelling that has gone on. But I think we can all accept that there were real figures there. Now, the first of them is Abraham. And it's useful, especially in this day and age, a time of mass migration around the world, immigrants, refugees. It's interesting really to think about Abraham as maybe a refugee or an immigrant. He came out of when the Mesopotamian city-state of Ur, with which we began our story of the world, within Hedjuana, when that city-state collapsed, there was great upheaval. And people scattered and moved away from it, moving in all sorts of directions. And Abraham was one of those. If you want to tie it down to real time, he was probably on the move sometime around 1,800 years before the birth of Christ. So the better part of 4,000 years ago. He left the city-state, Ur, and he settled. Don't think about him moving on his own. He's probably the figurehead of a tribe, or certainly of a big extended family. So he's not moving on his own. He's coming with people. And he and they settle in Canaan. There's a good biblical place name. They settle in the land of Canaan, which is in the Levant. So obviously he has descendants. You know, he has wives, he has offspring. And those people on the move, dispossessed, homeless, rootless for a while, for an unspecified period of time, they are the Hebrews. Now, we think of Hebrew really as a language, which it is, but Hebrew, the word, it means wanderer. That's literally what it means. So it's as likely to have been applied by the people that they moved among. They were seen to be wandering. That's more of them. There's more of those wandering types, that tend to pass through. Hebrew is actually mentioned for the first time, it's written down for the first time in Egyptian texts of the 14th century BC, which would be, 1,400 years before the birth of Christ and onwards. But by that time, the Hebrews had been on the move for a while. And according to the Bible story, and remember the Bible stories, they're based on something factual. Something really happened to real people. And it was of an importance and a significance that means that that story is with us to the present day. So whatever happened, and however it's been, mythologized and the truth of it has been muddied, it was real people really on the move in a time of, famine, some kind of hardship, maybe conflict. Some of those Hebrews came out of Canaan and into Egypt. Okay, and one of the named names in the Bible stories is Jacob, who's another of the patriarchs, the father figures. And everyone who's seen Joseph in his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Jacob's the father of 12 sons. And Jacob, he of the coat, he left the family behind and went ahead, and he established himself somehow or other as a senior official for Pharaoh in Egypt. Okay, so he got in there ahead, but he was followed in time by more of his kind. The truth of why he was on the move, it's difficult to tell. But this was happening, this movement of these Hebrews, perhaps headed up by Jacob, it's happening around the time of that second intermediate period in Egyptian history. The Egypt that they are within is an Egypt that has come out of a long period of certainty and cohesion, and it's now in one of those thin layers of jam, which the historians and the Egyptologists struggle properly to understand exactly what was happening when, but the Hebrews are in the mix of it. They're in there. And what we are confident of is that the second intermediate period was a time when part of Egypt was ruled by a people called the Hyksos, Hyksos. Now, no one to this day knows who the Hyksos were. And inconveniently, they leave nothing behind. They're around for a while, they dominate part of Egypt for a while, but when they go and the Egypts get back into control, the Egyptians wipe the blackboard clean.
How long were they in control for?
Hundreds of years. Okay, so the Hyksos comes from two Egyptian words, Hegakas, which means foreign kings. So the Egyptians remembered a time when they were ruled by outsiders, or at the very least people that they didn't consider to be Egyptians. For the sort of blood and soil nationalist Egyptians, these people weren't right. They were from the outside in some way, but we might simplify what was going on there and say that it was a time when Egypt lost its way and outsiders took control, certainly in what's called the Lower Kingdom, which is the Nile Delta, which is that part of Egypt where the Nile goes into the Mediterranean. Okay, that's the Lower Kingdom. It seems reasonable to say that it would only have been in a time of uncertainty and a lack of cohesion that foreign leaders and a foreign people could have risen to dominance. For example, a Joseph of the Hebrews, who arrived in Egypt for whatever reason as an outsider, could only have risen to dominance, for want of indigenous figures being in control. If you think about it, why is someone coming in from Canaan? Why would he rise up through the ranks? It's because it was a period of uncertainty. Centuries after that time, maybe 3 or 4 centuries, there's an exodus out of Egypt by at least some of those Hebrews. And this is the time of Moses. Okay, so the Hebrews, having been in Egypt for hundreds of years, maybe 300 or 400 years, they leave. They are led out of Egypt by Moses. And after a long and uncertain period of time, they arrive in Canaan. They go back into the land from which their forefathers had come, which is regarded at that point as the promised land. And the way we read the Old Testament has Joseph and his people's arrival in Egypt from Canaan, and then subsequently their departure back into Canaan. The way the Old Testament tells it, it happens to just one group of people, a group of people who sort of understand themselves as a defined group throughout. But more recently, Egyptologists and historians have suggested that that story was deliberately assembled over time, deliberately to give a sense of identity to 2 distinct groups. It was in the interests to bring those 2 groups together as one. And so the folk story, the backstory, was reverse engineered after the fact to give credibility to the idea that the same people that left Canaan and went into Egypt then, after a period of a few hundred years, left Egypt and came back. But it seems more likely that there were 2 groups, one that originated in Egypt and the second that originally came out of Mesopotamia. You know, so you've got one group of people arriving in Canaan out of the west, which is Egypt, and you've got another group arriving in Canaan out of the east, which is Mesopotamia. And sometime later, it was sort of politically expedient to create a backstory that blurred that and made it all happen to the same people. You know, to give the people a sense of togetherness and a sense of being as one.
So they would say Moses led them all from
Egypt. Yeah. It was all the same people.
Yeah.
But it seems more likely that it's a backstory that gives unity to 2 different groups of people. And there are clues that make that seem likely. For a start, the name Moses, it has its roots in the Egyptian language, because you see it in other famous Egyptian names like Amos and Tutmos. You know, those are Egyptian names. Those are pharaonic names with the same sound in them. You know, so whoever the Hebrews were, it seems likely that Joseph was an Egyptian and led a group of Egyptians out of Egypt and into Canaan. Okay, so it's enough just to think that Bible story is a creation out of expediency to give a sense of togetherness to more than one group of people. I can't tell, no one can tell a story of the world without at least touching on the stories that are fossilised in the Bible. But what is fascinating, whatever your position on the significance or not of the Bible, it's just at least fascinating to look beyond the shadows and those stories that we all heard at school, populated by shadowy figures like Abraham, like Joseph, like Moses, and to see them as real people. You know, to remember that somewhere amongst it is the reality of those individuals. And it's also fascinating to accept that they were moving within and among the people known as Hyksos. That's the world that they're a part of. That's the Egypt that they're a part of. So then we have to consider the Hyksos themselves. Now, they may have been invaders. I mean, look at our civilization in the West. You know, our civilization in the West feels like it's fraying. It feels like it's losing its sense of identity, its sense of cohesion. And you can imagine a group taking it by the scruff of the neck, taking control. It's in periods like this that we are in now that a different group can take control and move things in a slightly different direction. So it may well be the case that the Egyptian civilization was kind of, you know, had, for some reason or a combination of reasons, had lost a bit of cohesion. And perhaps the Hyksos were looking on at that from beyond the borders of Egypt and took their chance. Maybe there was an invasion. Maybe there was a coordinated move by these outsiders seeing that the time was right. Or, alternatively, they may have been a group of immigrants, people who had come in from the east or had come in from the north, who were living as immigrants within Egypt, and perhaps during the time of crisis by the locals, they took an opportunity to take control for themselves. Or if there was a power vacuum because the ruling group, ceased to function properly, they may have been pulled in by that power vacuum. But in any event, there was also a crucial role, and here is where we actually start getting to the moment in the story of the world. It's also about technology. Again, look at us at the moment. A lot of what's happening, a lot of the changes that are happening at the moment are about technology and adapting to technology, as well as different peoples coming into Egypt. Some of those people seem to have brought in an advanced technology that the Egyptians at that time couldn't cope with, and by which they were overwhelmed. Now, if we go back in history to Sumer, where we find the city-state of Ur, there are already illustrations on walls and elsewhere of soldiers being moved around in four-wheeled wagons pulled by asses or other beasts of burden, so that we know that thousands of years ago people had understood the value of moving people about in wheeled vehicles. But they were hardly weapons of war. If they were used in war, they would have been little more than taxis, really, moving armoured men towards the battlefield. Also, I'm trying here to sketch in the background to warfare using chariots, but it's an evolution, and part of that evolution is provided by an Indo-European people called the Kassites, and they came out of Iran, specifically the Zagros Mountains. We know about them because they attacked Babylon around 1,800 years BC. So at the time when there was some sort of upheaval in Egypt, the Kassites were also on the move. Now, they had horse-drawn vehicles. They were beaten off at that time, but they came back into Babylon a couple of hundred years later and then ruled for 500 years or so. Now, the Kassites were among the first people who had domesticated horses. In fact, the Kassites worshipped horses. So significant were they to their civilization. The Kassites had learned how to harness their horses to two-wheeled vehicles. So not the four-wheeled clumsy carts of the Sumerians, but much more manoeuvrable two-wheeled vehicles. So by the time the Hyksos arrive in Egypt, whoever they were, they had chariots. Okay? Now, they don't just come in with chariots, they've also got, we know this from illustrations and from the records, they've got composite bows for shooting arrows, and they've got socketed bronze axes. Now, it sounds pretty primitive to us, but that combination, chariots with men aboard armed with bronze axes and with bows, that's the arrival of superior technology. The Egyptians at that time, their army was infantry, and they were carrying things like maces, stones on the end of chains, or stones on the end of ropes, and they were lightly armoured. So up against an enemy with chariots, the chariots were iron shod, the wheels were rimmed with iron, another metal that the Egyptians knew nothing about at that point. So in a time of uncertainty, in a time of disruption anyway, there suddenly appears among them the Hyksos, who've got iron-wheeled chariots, and they've got composite bows, and they've got bronze axes, and the Egyptians are overwhelmed. So this is how the Hyksos, the foreign kings, come to dominance. They might as well be aliens arriving in their UFOs. So technologically challenging are they for those Egyptians. The Egyptians had never seen the like, and they were briefly overwhelmed. It's interesting, sort of side note really, that horse riding, it was old in some parts of the world, obviously. People were riding horses and using horses in some areas thousands of years before horse riding and domestication of the horse was attempted anywhere else. And there is a theory that the Greek legend of the centaur, half horse, half man, is a folk memory of the first men on horseback. If you've never seen a horse, and you've certainly never seen a man riding a horse, your first encounter with them, you might think that you're dealing with a composite animal. So you can imagine how the idea of the centaur in Greek mythology might have come from just glimpses, maybe. People who were wiped out by mounted men, and the few survivors, who got away from the scene, described these things that were half, a four-legged men. You can imagine how that would get about. So, even the advent of horse riding and mastery of the horse was a significant technological advance, and shocking and surprising when it arrives amongst people who've seen neither.
So at that time, the Egyptians didn't have horses?
No, they didn't have any of that. This is all new to them. So this is what begins centuries of Hyksos rule of Egypt, Lower Egypt, that half of Egypt closest to the Nile Delta, by foreign kings. Native Egyptian kings retain control in Upper Egypt at Thebes, further down into the desert of Africa. But although they're still notionally in control of their territory, they're paying homage to the Hyksos. So they have to bend, they have to take the knee. And that kind of experience for people, rule by outsiders, it's hard. And it's also unforgettable. People remember being conquered and being dominated by foreigners. It leaves deep scars, which are remembered and recounted long after the fact. So imagine the Egyptians, imagine the locals. They're dominated, but amongst them are those who are determined that it will not last and that they will reassert themselves. And what happens is that they learn, they watch, they pay attention to the technology of the Hyksos, and they take it for themselves. And after some period of time, 100 years, 200 years, who knows, they've quietly mastered all of it. Iron, spoked wheels, the chariot, the weaponry. They not only take it for their own, they become the greatest exponents of it. The Egyptians elevate the chariot to the time of its brightest flower, its greatest incarnation. Eventually, the Egyptians, in a significant technological advance of their own, they move the axle from the middle of the platform to the rear of it, which makes it infinitely more manoeuvrable, infinitely more nimble on the battlefield. The Hyksos had one man on the platform guiding the horses and a second man beside him with spears. The Egyptians replaced the spear thrower with an archer, armed with the composite bow. And eventually they refine the chariot. This is the moment that matters. They refine the chariot to the point where it's so light that it can be carried over short distances by just one man. So if he needs to, he can pick the chariot up and cart it across a river or whatever. This is the moment when the Egyptians, who've been subjugated by the foreign kings with their damned chariots, turn that same weapon back on the invader. This is the moment, from my point of view, that matters at this point in this story of the world. Up at Thebes, in the Upper Kingdom, there's an Egyptian king, a natural-born, blood and soil Egyptian king called Sekenenri Dao, and he is, like the rest of them, he's been taking the knee to the Hyksos. But what he does, rebellious spirit that he is, he seems to rebel against the Hyksos religion, and he tells his people to begin worshipping Ra again, the old god of the Egyptians. And word of this reaches the Hyksos king in Lower Egypt, in the Delta. He's Apopi, and he sends an army to crush Sekenenri and his rebellious ways. That initial rebellion under Sekenenri is crushed, and Sekenenri is killed in battle. But the spirit of rebellion, it's a bit like William Wallace, if you like. He dies, but the spirit of rebellion remains. And it's under his son Amos, with that same sound as Moses, Amos the First. He continues with the campaign of rebellion. And after some years, with the chariot and all the rest of it, he and his forces are able to retake Egypt. So they drive out the Hyksos and they retake the Lower Kingdom and bring the whole thing back together again. And it's all made possible by technology. They're invaded by technology. They have to be submissive to the new technology for a while, but rather than staying on their knees, they get up and quietly take that technology for their own and use it as the tool that enables them to push the invader out. So at that point, after whatever, couple of hundred years, maybe more, 200, 300, 400 years perhaps, the Hyksos are pushed out of Egypt. And they're not just pushed out of Egypt, they're pushed all the way to Canaan. Which is what, I mean, for a long time, there are still those, in fact, who think that once the Egyptians reclaimed their own land, that for a while they enslaved the Hyksos, put them to work for them, held them captive as a people. And then at some point, those Hyksos managed to escape, so that there has been a long folk tradition that the Hyksos were the Hebrews. That by the time the Hyksos got away from their enslavement and fled towards Canaan, that they themselves were the biblical Hebrews who fled Pharaoh, crossed the Red Sea and all, the parting of the Red Sea and all the rest of it. That's largely been set aside now. That is largely been set aside. But what it serves to do is to indicate that Egyptologists and historians are not clear to this day what happened. They're certainly not clear what happened. They just know that the time of the Hyksos passed. What precisely became of the Hyksos, nobody knows, because they leave next to nothing behind them. Because history ultimately is written by the victors. And although the foreign kings were dominant for 200, 300, 400 years in Egypt, once they were removed, the victorious Egyptians undid everything that the Hyksos had done. Much later on, in the 1st century AD, so centuries later, the Romano-Jewish historian Titus Flavius Josephus, looking back through the records, found the writings of an Egyptian historian called Manetho, who had himself kept accounts of what the Hyksos had done in the homeland of Egypt. And to quote from that, "For what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from the regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force they easily overpowered the rulers of the land. They then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others." Now, Manetho was writing in the 3rd century BC, so he himself was writing long after, centuries after the Hyksos had been driven out. But the bitterness with which he was able to write after all that time gives you an idea of how bitter had been remembered the time of the Hyksos, for whatever reason. So, as I say, in the intervening period, whatever was of the Hyksos, almost nothing has been recovered by archaeologists and Egyptologists, because at the end of the day, they were ground into the dust and the sand of the desert by the iron-rimmed wheels of the chariots that the Egyptians had learned to use against their sometime oppressors. A civilization powering forward across a vast landmass, an era of great change brought on by either invasion or evolution, and a sacred text recited and remembered for thousands of years. Next time in my love letter to the world. To help support this podcast and to get access to new and exclusive history and comment vodcasts every week, sign up to my Neil Oliver Patreon site. It'd be great to see you there. Check out the Instagram account called Neil Oliver Love Letter, my YouTube channel simply called the Neil Oliver Channel. And to build this podcast, please tell your friends about it, get them listening, and write a review to convince the online crowd to join us. For further reading about these moments in time, you could try my book. It's called The Story of the World in 100 Moments, and it's published by Transworld. Neil Oliver's Love Letter to the World is produced by Paul Ratcliffe and Neil Oliver for Fat Belly Films. Music is composed by Milo McKinnon. Social media and YouTube producer is Oscar, CFR. Additional research is by Evie, Lucian, Archie and Teddy. Finance is by Catherine and Trudy. Post-production is by Althorpe Studios, and the graphics are by Paul Plowman. Thanks for listening. This has been an FBF Podcasts production. Dun, 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 dun.